So we've got our first look at the latest leaked cards in Marvel Snap. These are expected to land in October. They're all like symbiote themed, and a couple of them seem pretty crazy. Like this card could actually be effectively a 221 power 2-drop if things go well. We've got some other pretty nifty and interesting effects in this video. Notably, we don't have any new activate cards. You may remember in the September season, we're seeing the introduction of that activate keyword, but none of these showed up with activate. That said, of course, these are data mines. These are not necessarily final. We often see changes to one or two of these cards in any given month. Sometimes, you know, balance changes, getting numbers bigger or smaller, or sometimes we've even seen effects change as well, like recently with Hydra Bob. So ultimately, you know, these are interesting to look at, can give us a preview. Usually a few of these make it through unscathed, but keep in mind if anything looks totally crazy, it may not land that way. That said, let's take a look at the card I think looks totally crazy. This is Scream. She is a 2/1 that reads, when an enemy card moves, steal 2 power from it once per turn. And since she's stealing that 2 power, that means they're getting that -2, you're getting that +2. That's a 4-point difference every single time this goes off. Technically, it could even go off on turn 2 if they move a card themselves on turn 2, which means, you know, in theory, 5 turns, even more with Limbo, of Scream going off makes this like a 221 sometimes. -10 from them, +10 for you. That one base stat, that is an absolutely crazy output for a 2-drop. Now, you know, interestingly, because there's that affliction aspect where you're stealing that power, it does expose some of that swing to Luke Cage, but also offers you affliction synergies. You know, we've got Ajax, Abomination cards that benefit from those afflictions, could you know, work something together with Scream potentially. On the other side, you know, you're not as exposed to things like Shadow King necessarily, because some of the power gain from Scream is by afflicting your opponent. So, you know, if Shadow King debuffs her stats, okay, I still netted some bonus by debuffing their stuff. That Shadow King could, of course, also reset those depending on locations, but, you know, there's upsides and downsides essentially to the way this is kind of split in how it affects power. Now, you know, obviously, it's not going to be a 221 often, right? Or a 211 with -10, but we're going to call it a 221 for the sake of net output, because you're not going to always play move decks. Your opponents aren't going to always be moving things for you. So what you're going to have to do very often, of course, is put this in a deck where you're moving stuff yourself. And we've played some of these like move them decks where you have, you know, Polaris, Spider-Man, Stegron, Cannonball, Magneto, which is kind of accidentally a perfect curve there. I think I maybe added one extra card, but you can in essence play Scream on turn 2 and then play Polaris, play Stegron, play Cannonball, play Magneto, and this card's going to get that 4 activations more or less guaranteed, as long as, you know, the targets line up right. And that already makes this insane. That's still 16 points again and a net advantage. -8 to them, +8 to you. That's crazy for a 2-drop. If you have any other, you know, synergies or bonuses for the move stuff, you know, we've talked about like Miles Morales and those packages. Of course, Kraven and this compete a little bit, but I think this is just like 1,000 times better than Kraven as far as like how it works. It doesn't need to be in a specific location. It doesn't have to work out. It doesn't scale quite as high with more movements, but, you know, in that sort of deck, it's going to be much more easy to activate. And, you know, it's hitting for 4 every time, not just 2. So to me, like, this looks really cool as a great early power card in those sort of decks. We've seen too, you know, we know these 2-drops that scale a ton are super valuable. Now, you know, that said, this is also coming out right after the kind of like Spider-Man-y season that had a handful of different move cards. There was like Madam Web and so on. So this could be a tech card of sorts against a move meta if a move meta becomes a thing. I think you'll need to self-direct it more. I think you'll have to run the cards yourself, moving things yourself to make this worth it consistently enough, because you don't want a 2/1 that's just completely dead in some matchups. So this might be relatively niche. I also think that kind of hybrid stuff I tease where you put this in an affliction deck, it's probably too hard to piece all of that together. I really think this becomes more of a linchpin of a movement and disruption deck running the sort of cards we talked about, which can, you know, be a cool deck. We've like had moderate success with that sort of thing in the past, but it felt like it needed this sort of card that was great at scaling for itself, unlike Craven, which often feels a little iffy in those packages when you're not moving your own stuff. Craven's better when you're kind of moving your own stuff and maybe doing both even, but Scream, of course, just on enemy cards here alone. So ultimately, I think you're looking at huge potential number output on this one. Like the swings on this are absolutely crazy. It's probably just going to be relatively niche in the sort of decks it works, which, you know, might mean it pops in and out of metas as maybe move becomes more popular, as cards get added that move your opponent's stuff. Scream might get little bursts here and there. That might be a good deck for a little while until something supplants it. So a lot of individual power output potential, just limited in its kind of scope or deck uses. That doesn't mean it's a bad card by any means. Actually means it's pretty nuts. Might even just define an archetype by itself, but might just be restricted to that archetype. So moving on here to Agent Venom. This is a 2/4. On reveal, set the power of all cards in your deck to 4. Cerebro 4 fans rejoice. You have the ultimate Cerebro 4 tool. Get set your Cerebro and your Mystique to 4. You're off to the races. And I mean, honestly, that's not the craziest idea. You don't necessarily, you know, want to have to rely on this sort of card for a Cerebro deck. You wouldn't be running like 5 power stuff in there, just hoping your Agent Venom connects on it. But, you know, bringing a few smaller things up sometimes that don't normally break your game plan, but do offer you that occasional Cerebro bonus, Mystique bonus, you know, some little small tech card or whatever you wanted to weave in the mix. This is a possibility because it's not really sacrificing much. Playing a 2/4 on turn 2, completely fine. Like, you're not going to be mad about that in a Cerebro 4 deck. So kind of a meme, but also probably interesting. Like, I think that's a real possibility. Plus C4 is just such a good name for a deck, especially if it has any sort of explosive components. So Cerebro definitely a thing, but I actually don't even think that's really the right place for Agent Venom necessarily. I think just any deck that has a lot of low powered stuff is pretty happy to find this card and play it on turn 2. Because that is how many draws, right? Turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, and turn 6. You're getting 4 draws that potentially have a nice little bonus buff. You're going to end up playing some of those before the end of the game. And if you're hitting 0 power stuff, this might be netting you like 4, 8, 12 power in essence throughout the course of the game, as long as you're able to successfully play those top decks. So, you know, I kind of think about like a Mr. Negative list, the same sort of cards where you have a lot of 0 power stuff, 1 power stuff. You know, think about like a 5/4 Iron Man, for instance. That's insane. Is it as good as Mr. Negative Iron Man at 0/5? Well, no, of course not. But Mr. Negative asks a little more of you. You got to spend your whole turn 4. You're playing a -1. This card, you're playing out on tempo. You're pretty happy. Plus, it's coming down on turn 2, so you know you're not as desperate to like grab as many draws after the Mr. Negative with help through like Jane and those sorts of things. Those can be big swings, but that deck can whiff really hard. This is like kind of a lower ceiling, more consistent route to a similar sort of game plan where you can scale up all of those low power units and suddenly make them really interesting. You know, all of that, you know, Ironheart, Sage, all of that getting +4 is really nice. And I'm sure there will be some decks that are able to piece together a package where that looks really good. You know, we've already seen Ravonna powering similar sorts of things, all these like 1 power, 0 power things. Agent Venom could do a similar sort of idea, where instead of, you know, decreasing the cost to make things more efficient, it's just increasing the power output to make things more efficient. Not to mention, you know, there are literally negative power cards. Run this with a Hood and you're gaining a +7 on your Hood. That's completely insane. It's already a great card. If you give Hood +7, man, that's nuts. Now, you don't want your deck to be too reliant because, you know, you're going to draw some of these things ahead of time. They won't get in the Venom, but I think the payoffs on this will still be worth it because the baseline's so strong. This is easily going to feel like a 2/8, a 2/12, and beyond very, very often because of all those additional buffs. I think even decks that are just running a lot of like 2 power stuff, you know, 3 power stuff can make this work. The risk and the cost of this card, of course, is that you can't run bigger stuff. Most decks will have a staggered package of smaller things and, you know, a key big thing here and there. You know, they'll run a big Vision, a big Red Hulk, whatever finisher kind of 6-drop, a Magneto sometimes. So you might have like a tempo move package too that's just got like a Nocturne and a Spider-Man and some 5 power stuff. Well, Agent Venom makes that 5 power stuff a little bit worse. So there is this real upside to realize, but then there's the restriction as well, where the deck list has to be molded and make sense for Agent Venom. But my premise is that's not actually a huge task. Even just look at something like a Silver Surfer deck. Very easy often to make a Silver Surfer deck make a ton of sense with Agent Venom, because it's like, okay, I got Brood, Absorbing Man, Surfer. Hey, those are all totally fine, big power payoffs. Agent Venom kind of fits right in, right? You can run, like we said, a Mr. Negative style deck with just a lot of 0 power things. Agent Venom fits right in. That could still be a complete deck. So it is a restriction. It is a requirement. It is going to take a little bit of pondering and some tweaking to get deck lists to fit into an Agent Venom mold. But I think they will. I don't think it's going to be a problem at all, because I think the upside here is a lot to realize and can make some absolutely big swings with how that scales. So ultimately for me, I think Agent Venom actually looks like a really solid card. I think Cerebro might actually be better than you think. And then I think other decks just fit with this really nicely as well, whether it's Silver Surfer or, just some good like tempo on reveal decks with a lot of different low power cards that just benefit so nicely from this. So our next card here is Misery. This is a big old 5/10 with on reveal. Repeat the on reveal abilities of your other cards here, then destroy them. So yeah, this is Odin sort of, but a much meaner version, because it's destroying your cards. Also a little cheaper and a little bigger. And when I compare this to Odin, I'll be honest, so far I'm having trouble identifying a lot of opportunities where this feels that much better. A couple things that come to mind to me are like curve reasons. So you have like Shuri on turn 4 into Misery on turn 5. It's really nice big body on curve to follow up your Shuri. That also gives you that like secondary Shuri effect again. That does kind of feel like overkill to keep playing into the same location. But it's a possibility that could be a reason to do this. That's where the cost really comes in to effect here. Also, just destroying stuff with negative stats. We talked about Hood in our previous card. Another great example here. Get another demon for turn 6, while wiping out those negative Hood stats. It's a little extra bonus here for your Misery. The way this is currently worded, it does seem like, armor is a possibility to kind of negate the downside of Misery, while, of course, realizing the benefit of having a much earlier Odin style effect, or a little earlier Odin style effect. But I did see another version on Twitter that seemed to have slightly different wording that seemed to suggest you kind of needed to destroy them to trigger it. So a little bit of inconsistencies there. Of course, we'll kind of find out. Sometimes having that many cards to set up something's a little bit of overkill anyway. So, this also just, can realize any destroy effects. We don't, looking at the set right now, have a lot of cards that have like on reveal and destroy. There's no like Bucky Barnes that does both of those things. You're really happy. I mean, there's technically like Electro could be an on curve fit for this. It's one of the few that you kind of want to destroy, even though it's not a destroy card technically. You want to realize it's on reveal. So like Electro on turn 3 into Misery on turn 5. You wipe out that downside. You lose 2 power, but you don't really care because you don't want that ongoing effect for Electro. So, those kind of things that pair a downside or a reason to kill them with an on reveal are rare, but that's one example that came to mind. So, each of those feels like kind of niche. It doesn't mean they won't carve out a deck, but they're like pretty specific in what they do, because you're trying to work around this downside of destroying stuff, which does kind of, remove a lot of cards from the consideration for this being worth it. So is there a Shuri deck? Is there like an Electro ramp deck where this just feels really necessary and that works out well for you? Is there, some kind of like on reveal-y deck where you're doing this instead of, Wong, and maybe even in combination with Odin, who knows? But some reason this fits the curve better, or the power matters. Is there like Scar stuff because this is 10? I don't know. It's just so adjacent to Odin that it's like you have to find really specific scenarios for it, and that's the few I could think of. The Electro might actually sound the most promising to me in a weird way, although Shuri is also pretty intriguing. But I'm curious if you guys have other really specific use cases for this other than just like second Odin, which I guess is not necessarily a bad thing. Having some redundancy is also worthwhile. But pretty interesting card. It does seem to demand some thought on getting this to work really well. So moving on here, we have Anti-Venom. This is a 4/6. On reveal, set the cost and power of your deck's top card to 0. So potentially letting you play something pretty scary, pretty crazy for 0 cost, as long as you don't mind the fact that it has 0 power. And again, we're kind of talking about the same sort of cards here, I think. Potentially like big on reveal effects that, came with 0 power to start. You're totally fine with them having 0 power, but now you have, a White Tiger, a Shuri, whatever, an Ironheart, Sage, whatever it is, that now costs 0. So you don't mind the debuff to its stats, but you love the cost discount. Iron Man's another great example. I think, Null, if we're talking about like symbiotes and destroyed X, Null's a great example. Any ongoing card that scales well. 0 cost Iron Man, 0 cost Null, 0 cost Artem Zola, all of those can be great hits. So it's about finding a deck that does, kind of reward that. And then this kind of looks a little bit like an Iron Lad almost, a 4/6 that's like getting a free ability off the top card of your deck. I think in many cases I feel like Iron Lad's probably just better because it kind of duplicates the effect number 1, which can be really nice. Like if you get a Null, for instance, or an Iron Man or whatever, right? You're getting 2 Nulls, 2 Iron Mans, because Iron Lad becomes 1 and then you still have the 1 in hand, which you often don't mind paying full cost for because it's like one of your big star cards anyway. So, if I'm comparing this directly to Iron Lad, I have to think about instances where I'm really happy that the card is in hand versus like in play. And, sometimes that can be worth it from like a surprise factor. They don't really know what you got. You can dump a 0 cost Iron Man or Null or Arnim Zola or whatever and really surprise them because of that. So the unpredictability there is kind of nice, but sometimes unpredictability can be good, but I do occasionally think it's overrated, at least in comparison to just like raw output. Like sometimes just having 2 Nulls is way better than a surprise Null or whatever, right? But then there are instances too, like Artem Zola, where maybe the Iron Lad doesn't want to Artem Zola. It's more of a timed kind of effect that you really value. So there are ways perhaps to build into that, but how dense can you make your deck with those sort of effects that really pay this off? Because you're only just getting the top deck and you aren't really controlling what your top deck is necessarily going to be. So it's like, a deck construction, a timing problem. It has to be better than things like Iron Lad too, which again, I've explained why that's not always the case. So, man, I don't know. Anti-Venom, it's cool in theory, but dude, I think there's going to be a hard time finding a deck and a list that seems to support this so well. Because so often it's going to whiff and just hit something low cost, because most decks have, low cost stuff. It doesn't really feel like you did much off your Anti-Venom and you just kind of played a 4/6. And then even when it does hit sometimes, is it going to be swingy enough? Is it going to make enough of a difference comparative to other cards that are doing really nice, big, proactive things? Iron Lad, or plenty of other 4-cost examples. So I don't know, man. I definitely see the lines here, but I almost feel like Anti-Venom could use a little bit of a stat bump or something. It's scary because he does create some real game-winning high roll moments. It's just balancing those out against the moments where you feel like he didn't really do much at all, and finding the line there. So maybe they've decided 4/6 is the safe spot for that, but I do have concerns about him finding a home when that's the case, because I think it's just going to whiff so often, and the payoffs are going to feel solid, but not like absolutely insane most of the time, that he might just fall a little too short. So moving on here to Scorn. This is a 1/2. It reads, when you discard this, give its power to one of your cards in play, and then return this to hand with +1 power, which I think makes this a pretty intriguing little discard engine of sorts to just help scale up some of those stats. We know we have multiple ways to discard small stuff from your hand in the discard package. We did actually get a change to Moon Knight today that he affects even cost cards, which wouldn't hit Scorn. She's an odd cost card, but plenty of other ways to get rid of the small stuff. Calling Wing, etc. could hit your Scorn. And I think the scaling on this is actually really nice. Like, you're getting that 2 power in essence for free right off the bat with Scorn. Any future discards already feel great. Like getting another +3 power without having to spend any additional incremental energy on it is really nice. Like that's suddenly +5. And then you go if you can get another +4 off like your MODOK later or whatever, it's like, my God, this 1-drop gave me 9 power. I haven't even played it. And guess what? You still have like a 1/5 in hand at that stage. If you've discarded it 3 times, you're still going to play the 1/5 at the end. You don't have to finish the game with this card in hand. Play it out, let your Dracula discard the APOC a final time, and it's like, boom. I got to play a 1/5 and it also netted me a ton of power. Or, even if you're not greedy, I got to play a 1/3 and it netted me like 2 power on board, or 1/4 and it netted me 5 power on board. Like, that's some pretty nice math coming together on Scorn after just 1 or 2 discards. I think this starts to pay off really well. And I like that you don't even really have to necessarily spend the energy on it to net any benefits. So if things don't line up from a curve standpoint, if you need to just keep playing discard cards, this is still doing the work from in hand. It doesn't have to be on board to get you that help. So for me, I don't know, man. I think that's a pretty interesting way to just start scaling up a little bit here, a little bit there in a discard deck. The power is admittedly a bit unpredictable until she's played, but I think you shouldn't sleep on the fact that you get to play this at the end of the game potentially and play a nice like 1/4 or whatever to supplement as needed. That can fill in rather well. So I actually think Scorn looks pretty cool. I think discard needs this sort of stuff to get it to that next level. It's always like a solid deck. You can win with it, but it's never the top of the meta. These sort of cards to me could give it that little extra power boost here and there to give it the oomph necessary to actually reach the top levels of play. So I definitely wouldn't sleep on Scorn. Definitely a specific card, definitely in a discard niche, of course, but I think a really, really good fit for that. And then our final card here is Toxin. This is a 3/2 with on reveal. Return your other cards here to your hand, +2 power for each returned, which, yeah, this kind of looks like a beast alternative or perhaps accomplice. Maybe you run both of these in a bounce deck for a little redundancy. Bounce your beast back to hand, use the beast to bounce your Toxin back to hand. My God. It's an endless loop. You had endless energy. And I do think energy might be the problem for this card. It's a little bit more of an expensive of a bounce than Beast. And notably, you know, Beast gives you that discount on your bounced cards. This instead is giving you, you know, plus power, which is a fair exchange, right? I think that's okay. This can definitely be a 3/8. If you bounce 3 cards, 3/8s are big, but do keep in mind, of course, if you're bouncing those cards, you're kind of losing stats in exchange for stats, which might be worth it if, you know, the on reveals or the effects of the cards being bounced are worth it to replay. Beast is exactly the same conversation, but of course, Beast has that discount. So particularly for like 1-cost cards, you're not really spending anything extra to replay those stats. You know, you get to replay your Korg or Iceman or whatever for free. So the fact that you bounce them, you're not really losing that power. Beast is also only 2 energy, so a little bit easier to weave in. I do have some concerns about Toxin finding the right moments and then having the follow-ups as well if you're playing things at full cost after bouncing them. You kind of have to have enough time before this and after this. And if you're only bouncing like 1 or 2 cards with Toxin, I think it feels really weak because it's like a 3/4. 3/6 is good, but again, that's an exchange for extra energy spent and a card replayed. So it is 3/6, but not exactly. You got to spend the energy again to get the power you stole from the board back. I mean, Hoods may be one example. Again, Hood, my God, where, you know, it is just a total net power output gain if that Hood's hidden from the board. So, you know, I think it's an interesting alternative, and it does like let you kind of shift power in a way that Beast doesn't. Like, you know, it's like, okay, I had all this stuff here and I'm gonna like lock that kind of in with Toxin and then maybe redeploy that power elsewhere. There's kind of something there, but that sort of happens with Beast as well, to be honest. So I don't know, man, something about this one just feels a little bit clunky to me. And I don't know. I feel like it just needs something more or different to set it apart, because right now it just feels like Beast, but slightly different and slightly worse. And I don't know that there's any other decks I see a home for this in. Maybe I'm missing an angle here that's a little bit spicier for this one. But, you know, if it like gained the stats of the cards you bounce and it was like, you know, a Venom that was more expensive or started smaller or something, I could see an angle there, right, where you could bounce some really big stuff and make some crazy plays, but obviously that wouldn't work at a 3/2, but, you know, it would do something a little distinct. This just feels too close to Beast, but not distinct enough to actually be any better, as far as I can tell. Yeah, so that's the October season of cards. A couple standouts, I think, a couple having a harder time seeing the lines in, but now we're going to actually rank these cards from the ones I think are going to be the best to the worst. My number 1 card is Scream. My number 2 card is Scorn. My number 3 card is Agent Venom. My number 4 card is Misery. My number 5 card is Anti-Venom. And my number 6 card is Toxin. Yeah, I just realized I'm going to have a really hard time remembering the names of all these. It's just like I'm angry. The cards. I'm angry vocabulary words. But I'll do my best. Anyway, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on all these cards. What kind of decks do you think are going to play these? Which are you most excited to try? I am curious to hear all of those different thoughts and more. Do you see more of a home for Toxin than I do? Does Bounce just need more of this? Is there some other deck? Share all those thoughts down in the comments below. Thank you as much as always for watching. And until next time, game on.